Hello, our topic is different systems of astrological interpretation. This happens to be part 4 of a 4-part introductory series in astrology, but this video also stands by itself perfectly well, so you do not need to watch any of the first 3 parts. Now, what are the most common astrological systems? I've divided them into 3 kinds: Western astrology, Vedic astrology, and other systems. And under Western astrology, I've listed some variations of this. Keep in mind that people do things. They play music. Some people play jazz, various kinds of classical music, various kinds of, Indian music, etc. They don't play music so that historians can come in later and nicely divide them into categories. Same thing with astrology or anything else. So these divisions that I've made are somewhat arbitrary. I think they actually fit very well, at least for people in North and South America, Europe, and actually probably most of the world. This really works pretty well because a lot of the, what I've classified as others, like Chinese, various East Asian, Mayan, etc., are not widely practiced in most places in the world. The most widely practiced are the Western and Vedic. And Vedic also has many variations. So I'm going to go through these different styles of astrology so you have some idea of what they are. Modern psychological. This is the most common system in the West, whether it's Europe, North America, South America, etc. Most people practice Western astrology. And the astrological rules in modern psychological astrology are the rules that I described in part 1 of this series, the introduction to astrology, and also in part 3, where I describe how charts are interpreted. The emphasis is on the 12 zodiac signs, the 12 houses, up to about 9 aspects. Everybody uses the 5 aspects, sometimes called the Ptolemaic aspects: conjunction, opposition, square, trine, sextile. Quite a few astrologers also use the semi-square and the sesquiquadrat. Quite a few use the semi-sextile and the quincunx. That adds up to 9. That's where I got 9, the 5 Ptolemaic, plus the semi-square, sesquiquadrat, semi-sextile, and quincunx. So usually it goes up to about those 9 aspects. Most people don't use much more than that. The rulerships, some people use a few asteroids, some usually not using midpoints, not using many of the classical astrology methods. This is generally what we call modern Western astrology. And the philosophy of modern Western astrology is generally to empower the person and help the person make good decisions. This may not be the emphasis of some of the popular astrology where they tell you you're going to become rich, come to Madame Rosa and I will read your cards and do your astrology and I will tell you how to find love, happiness, and you better call me because I saw something in the sky in your chart, so you better call me right away and I'll save you from it. That kind of approach is considered to be unethical by the mature and ethical astrologers. And by the way, I'm not knocking reading cards, tarot cards. That's great. I get card readings myself. I'm talking just about that attitude and so on. So the Western astrology approach is about empowering people to make the right decisions and to make the most of their astrological energies. And in modern Western astrology, which tends to be psychological, the emphasis tends to be psychological, not that people don't talk about medical problems or other physical things, but usually the emphasis is more psychological, and even that the medical issues reflect a psychological or energetic process. Some of the modern Western astrologers refer to themselves as Jungian, after Carl Jung, emphasizing the astrology chart as being archetypal stories, where we are participating in the archetypal story. The archetypes are, you might say, eternal or fundamental to the human psyche, and they work through us. So there's Jungian, modern psychological. Some of the psychological astrologers are not specifically Jungian. Some focus on cycles. For example, Saturn returns back to where it was when you were born about 29 years later. So there's a process of maturation as Saturn goes around and the other planets go around. They would focus on things like this. Some astrologers are modern Western with no particular affiliation as being clearly Jungian or cycle-oriented and developmental-oriented. They're just interpreting the astrological influences in terms of how it makes you extroverted or tending to be aggressive or tending to be certain ways in how to manage your energy the best way. And many people use hybrids of different approaches. But there are many, many styles of modern psychological astrology with many variations of rules and ideas of exactly what does Mars do in your chart, what does Aries do in your chart, with different perspectives, all of a energetic or psychological orientation. I'll also mention evolutionary astrology. There are so many variations of modern Western astrology that I won't be mentioning all of them or even thinking of all of them. But evolutionary astrology is probably worth mentioning. It has a fairly strong movement. Evolutionary astrology puts the emphasis on the birth chart as a roadmap for self-development. There's an emphasis on past lives, or usually not literally past lives, but a sense of past lives, even if it's not literally true. So the idea that you're born with a momentum, you're born with in motion, as if the story had started before you were born. That's the feeling of it. And you're coming into the life with certain challenges, certain goals, certain missions. And so the focus of the chart is on the chart as an evolving process, and you as an evolving process, more than on describing you, like looking at a crystal ball and saying, you are this, you are that, just descriptive. Instead of describing the person saying, oh, you're good in math, you're bad in sports, you can do this, you can make a lot of money, rather than just describing the person, it's focusing on what the challenge and goals and issues are for the lifetime. Looking at the lifetime as a lesson plan and a roadmap to development. Also, the evolutionary astrologers tend to use certain techniques. They often put a lot of emphasis on the moon's nodes, often on Pluto, sometimes the rising sign, also the moon sign. And of course, people don't fit into these molds in narrow ways. Some people take the evolutionary approach, but they may not necessarily be emphasizing the nodes and Pluto and rising sign or moon sign, things like that as much. But there is a central evolutionary astrology movement that does emphasize certain interpretive methods, such as the emphasis on the moon's nodes, as well as this philosophical perspective. Then there's classical astrology, which is essentially medieval astrology. Medieval astrology differs in many ways. One of the ways in which it differs is they often do horary astrology, which is where you set up a chart for the time a question is asked. So somebody will call the astrologer and ask, should I take this new job? And the astrologer sets up the astrology chart for the moment they receive that question, and they use a symbolic way of interpreting the chart to get a specific answer. And some of the classical astrology tends to be more factual than the modern Western. That's not necessarily true, but usually that's the tendency. It tends to be a little less emphasis on the psychology and more emphasis on what's happening. That's a relative tendency, but I think it tends to be a little more factual and psychological. Modern Western astrology to be a little more psychological and less factual. Tendencies. There are exceptions to rules, but that's the overall tendency. Also, in medieval astrology, typically a lot of emphasis is placed on essential dignities. I'll show you that. Here I'm in the Series 2.0 software. Here's the birth chart of Rob Hand. It's very beautiful, very intriguing, but a classical astrologer could not do very much just looking at this wheel. If I right-click and I select one of the medieval style wheels, it may not look as pretty. Most astrology is not based on making things look really pretty, but it has the information, the essential dignities information right there. And here's another variation of it with the essential dignities, the exaltation, triplicity, the term, the face. These are things, the triplicity, for example, and the terms are not used in modern astrology. They're part of classical astrology, which has strong roots in the Middle Ages. Modern Western is a simplified, revived version of astrology that began, in the early 1900s, maybe you can go back as far as the late 1800s. So astrology was revived then and comes up with actually some pretty significant differences from a tradition that ran through the Middle Ages in Europe and the surrounding area. So the essential dignities table, things like sect, almutins, this is all part of the language of classical astrology. Particular Arabic parts are important. So some different techniques and slightly different philosophy involved in the classical astrology. Okay, covered all that. And then there's Hellenistic astrology, which is even older than the classical astrology, the medieval astrology. Somewhere in the range of, say, 400 BC to 500 AD. People give different dates because history doesn't begin and end in nice, neat little packages. Some people will say it's really from the year 0 or 100 to 600 AD, but somewhere in that range, there were various techniques that fell out of favor in the Middle Ages. They weren't used as much, such as the use of Time Lords for forecasting, and the use of whole sign houses. In the classical astrology, there's a tendency to use one of the quadrant houses. For example, Regiomontanus is one of the popular house systems used in classical astrology. Remember, there's many. Classical astrology covers, 1,000 years roughly. So there's a lot of different things going on over that 1,000 years in different places at different times. So there's not one, kind of classical or one kind of Hellenistic or one kind of modern. There's not all these variations. But you do see some strong changes as you go from the Hellenistic period to the classical period of astrology. Also, about forecasting is quite interesting because the Hellenistic tend to use these Time Lord methods. I have a tutorial video just on the Time Lord methods of Hellenistic astrology. One of the forecasting methods that was popular in the medieval period is primary directions. And today we use what are called secondary progressions. So the primary directions were very popular in the Middle Ages. I have a video on that. So you see different forecasting methods and also different interpretive methods. And there are overlaps in all these systems. There are some similarities of classical and Hellenistic, such as the use of essential dignities. And as with everything in astrology, there are variations of the essential dignities tables. There isn't just one. Okay, but these groups do work fairly well. Just like I can say there's jazz music and there's, say, rock and roll. They overlap sometimes and they steal ideas from each other. But if you hear a certain kind of jazz music, you know it's jazz. And if you hear a certain kind of rock and roll or certain kind of folk music or whatever, you can recognize it. And this is true in astrology. These categories usually work pretty well. The modern Western, Hellenistic, and classical. And another area of astrology, which is part of the modern Western, I grouped together several variations: harmonic astrology, symmetrical astrology, and cosmobiology, which is a name given to a midpoint system developed by an astrologer by the name of Reinhold Eberton. I practice harmonic astrology, and the style of harmonic astrology I call vibrational astrology. So in harmonic astrology, the emphasis is on minor aspects. Harmonic astrologers don't think they're so minor, even though they're called minor aspects. And these systems often put less emphasis on sign houses and rulerships. But every astrologer is unique and individual. Some astrologers use midpoints and rulerships. It's a free country. It's a free world, as the saying goes. So you can do whatever you want to do. But there are a lot of astrologers using some of these methods. They tend to put more emphasis on finding patterns, more intricate patterns in the chart based on the angular distances between planets, and often less emphasis on sign houses and rulerships. The midpoint structures involve 3 planets. Sometimes there are 4 planet patterns, which are known as planetary pictures. They're also known as midpoint. They're also known as isotraps, go under different names. So this is another group of astrological methods that's fairly distinct from the Hellenistic, the classical, and the more psychological forms of modern Western. And again, we're seeing variations. There can be a lot of difference between somebody who emphasizes midpoints and somebody who emphasizes minor aspects, and you could argue these shouldn't be all thrown together. But I put them together because there is something in common with all of them in terms of looking at more complex patterns. Okay, then in my first slide I emphasized 3 kinds of astrology: modern Western and Vedic, and then I just miscellaneous, the other ones. So some of the key features with Vedic: number 1, in Vedic astrology, usually the sidereal zodiac is used, different zodiac. I talk about that in the Introduction to Vedic Astrology, another tutorial video. And in the Astronomy for Astrology videos, I talk about what these zodiacs are and so on. But most Vedic astrologers use the sidereal zodiac. Most Western astrologers use the tropical zodiac. You always have to say most because there are exceptions to every rule. And in Vedic astrology, it has its own set of rules. They emphasize things like the Navamsa chart, what are called yogas, which are particular combinations of patterns in the chart. There's an emphasis on whether a planet is a friend or enemy of another planet. We don't have that emphasis in Western astrology. Particular ways for calculating planetary strength. And even the chart wheel itself is typically a north style or south style wheel, which looks different from the Western round wheel. So these are things that distinguish Vedic astrology from other forms of astrology. But what I'm describing are major themes that run through most of Vedic astrology. Again, it's hard to divide things very rigidly, but in most cases, what I'm describing works pretty well. Now, in Vedic astrology, like some of the more ancient forms, other Western ancient forms of astrology, tends to be a little more factual and concrete and less fuzzy, you might say, than modern Western psychological astrology. That's a tendency. That's not always true. I don't want to imply that this is always true. There are modern Western astrologers who predict weather or stock prices and other very factual things, or claim that they can predict them. And there are people who use Vedic astrology with an emphasis on the psychological dynamic. So this is not black and white, but you'll see this tendency overall. That's the tendency at this time. Okay, and then there are other forms of astrology like Chinese and various East Asian and Mayan and so on. there are so few people who practicing these. If you're in a major city in the United States or Canada or most of South America or Europe, usually there aren't a lot of astrologers practicing a detailed form of Mayan astrology or Chinese astrology, but there are some, and in some cities there may be a lot of them. But overall, at the major conferences, international astrology conferences, you don't see a lot of lectures and presentations on these other forms of astrology. Doesn't mean they're not important, doesn't mean I'm giving them second-class citizenship. I'm trying to give you a realistic appraisal of what people do, and what people do doesn't necessarily mean it's the best, but this is generally what's going on and what you're likely to encounter as you move around the world of astrology. Okay, and another thing we can look at is not only the different astrological theories, the different models, you might say, whether they're some form of Hellenistic or some form of classical, some form of modern psychological, is the application of astrology. Astrology is used for decision-making in personal life and business. Should I take this job? Should I expand my business at this time? Etc. Compatibility in relationships. Why am I having difficulty with my child? Or should I hire this person? Or am I going to get along with this supervisor? Etc. Personal performance, economic performance, used in, is this a good, who's going to win the game? Is this a good day for Team A or Team B to perform well? What kind of stocks or economic areas are likely to grow over the next few years? These are things that some astrologers work with. Relocational astrology. Where should I move to? Where should I do business? Where should I vacation? Weather, earthquakes, political situations. Those are sometimes called mundane astrology. Events in the world. Health is another area. And really just about anything. You want to know about your dog, your cat. Astrology is applied, to almost everything, it seems. Every kind of activity or anything that might have a birth or development that could be related to planetary cycles. Okay, so let me see, how many more slides? Okay, just these last two slides. So I'll summarize here where to go from here. If you've been watching this series of videos on introductory astrology, where I describe the basic language of astrology, the software options that are available to do astrology, how charts are interpreted, and now we've covered the different approaches to astrology. Where do you go from here? Well, if you're considering intensively studying astrology, explore these different systems. Try to pick one out. Whether it's some form of modern psychological or Vedic, something that appeals to you for whatever reason. You might know right from the beginning, you might already know, or you might need to explore a little bit. So that's one of the first steps, is decide which area you're going to go into. I've mentioned several times in various videos, you can't do it all. If you want to apply the ideas, you have to pick out one or two approaches and work with those. There are over 100 videos at the time I'm making this video, making at least one or two, sometimes even 3 a week, usually 1 or 2 a week. So lots of free information that I've put up. Of course, there's lots of other great websites, papers, articles, local astrology groups. For learning purposes, if you happen to own the Kepler or Sirius programs, the Avalon lessons that are part of those programs are wonderful. If you own WinStar Express, for example, the Astro Tutor feature, which I believe is in all the WinStars as well. I'm thinking of WinStar Express. If you're a beginner, you might be getting that program. So these learning features in some of the software are wonderful. And you may want to go to a school or apprentice under an astrologer. There are lots of, again, free classes and resources. Sometimes you can attend a free lecture. If you're going to enroll in a program, typically, of course, you have to pay a tuition fee. Some excellent schools, the Avalon School of Astrology is one that I teach at. Midwest School of Astrology in Cincinnati, Ohio is excellent. The International Academy of Astrology is excellent. Kepler College is excellent. And of course, there are a great many other excellent courses being given by astrologers. Most cities, probably all cities, have a local astrology group. You can find out who's teaching classes and what programs are available. As far as these videos go that I'm making, one of the next ones you might want to watch is Astrology, Divination, or Science. Here's the link to it, but it's called Astrology, Divination, or Science because it's the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, does astrology work? So far in these 4 introductory tutorials on astrology, I've been telling you about how to learn astrology, how to practice astrology, etc. Well, astrology is very controversial, and a lot of people feel like it's nonsense, and even astrologers don't agree on exactly what astrology can do for somebody. So this is a video that can be helpful if you're a beginner or even intermediate, or excellent for advanced people as well. What is astrology? What can we do with it or not do with it? And if you haven't found it, this is the link to my YouTube page of videos. Okay. I'm just mentioning here lots of other resources, papers, articles, teachers, books, etc., of course. So that's it. That's a quick introduction to some of the different styles of astrology. I'm sure I missed some, but at least that gives you some framework for understanding how astrology is done. I think that this video is very important because there are so many videos out there and papers and articles and lectures that teach astrology as if the kind that they're teaching is the only kind. It's as if you wanted to know about music and they showed you rock and roll, as if jazz didn't exist, as if all the various kinds of classical music didn't exist. So this is good to know about, these different options and different styles that are out there. And again, I'm sure there's lots of other ones I didn't mention, but I think I've covered some of the most important options that are out there. Okay, thank you very much for listening. God bless. Namaste.